Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Deploying Resource Portfolio Management to Drive Value Flow. My name is Andy Jordan. I am President of Referenzium Consulting, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I'll introduce you to Lloyd Norman in just a moment. He's going to be our speaker. But before I do, just a couple of admin things. First off, we are going to be recording the webinar today, so if you want to go over anything again, or if you want a colleague to hear it, then you'll get an email probably within 6 to 8 hours of the end of this, but certainly within 24 hours of the end of the webinar, which will have a link to the recording, so you can access it that way. That email will also have a link to access a copy of the slides, and we've also uploaded those slides to the handouts section of your GoToWebinar console, so you can download a PDF of those right now from that handout section. We will have some time today for questions at the end of the presentation, so if anything occurs to you as you're hearing Lloyd speak, please feel free to throw those questions into the question section of the GoToWebinar console. We will get to as many of them as we can before the end of the session. We also have a PDU available to you for attending this webinar, and I will give you all the information on that PDU and how to claim it before we wrap up at the end of the session. All right, so let me hand over to the main event and introduce Lloyd Norman to you. Lloyd is the Vice President of Strategic Solutions at Prosymmetry, the owner of Tempest Resource. Prior to joining Prosymmetry, Lloyd directed the Resource Management Office at a top 50 financial institution, where he architected an enterprise resource planning ecosystem that continuously aligns strategic project, agile initiative, and operational work with vital delivery resources. Lloyd has over 25 years of experience delivering value in RMO and PMO leadership roles as a managing partner in technology professional services firm and as a consultant with IBM. Lloyd is an entrepreneurial leader who has consulted with clients representing banking, aerospace, healthcare, DoD, manufacturing, oil and gas, and technology industries. Lloyd has a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from the University of Oklahoma, and I think you're really going to enjoy his presentation today. So Lloyd, I will shut up and over to you.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining me today. We've got about 50 minutes or so. I'd like to leave at least 10 minutes at the tail end of this to have questions. But with that said, let us dive in. Just real quickly about Tempest Resource, Prosymmetry, if you will. We've got hundreds of clients all over the world. And what we do is we help them optimize portfolio delivery, adaptability, and talent retention. All of those are interrelated. We're actually going to be discussing all of those today because they are essentially the primary components of, in fact, resource portfolio management. So thanks for joining us today. All right, let's talk about retention first. Unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably aware that the talent pool has been disrupted pretty significantly. It was heading that way already prior to COVID, but when the pandemic came, it really bubbled up to the surface. We saw tremendous turnover, something called the Great Resignation, which many of you are likely familiar with. Here in the United States, roughly 4 million people a month since the middle of 2022 have willingly changed jobs on their own. If you look at some of these comments on the left, that trend actually continues. It's interesting, I was visiting with a friend of mine. He actually heads the industrial engineering department at Texas Tech. And he shared an email with me a couple of days after we were chatting about this, stating that apparently higher ed is no different. The statistics for higher ed actually tracked very much what you're seeing here, where roughly 40% of people in higher ed were looking to make job transitions as well. So it's really happening across the industries, and it's why, if you look on the right here, this is a little infographic from Gartner. It's why workforce issues have now bubbled up to the third most important for CEOs in 2022 and 2023. And by workforce issues, that they intentionally called out attracting, retaining talent, right? Those kinds of things. PwC indicated this year that the #1 inhibitor to strategy delivery is access to skilled talent. And so when we talk about balancing portfolio delivery and making sure that we are adaptable as well as looking out for our talent, you really can't undersell the importance of making sure that you're looking out for your people. And we'll talk more about that as we go today. All right, now let's move to adaptability, sort of the second of the three legs of resource portfolio management, if you will. If you're going to adapt strategy at speed, you have to have effective resource planning in place. Think about what gates your delivery. I have spoken at numerous conferences literally around the world this year, and I have taken the opportunity at every one of those conferences to ask people, so what's gating your delivery? Is it your funding? What is it? And without exception thus far, it's been people. And so if you're going to, in fact, look at removing impediments to actually delivering and executing on your strategy, you better be looking at your people. If you're familiar with the theory of constraints, it's consistent with that idea that you should be removing the primary impediment to whatever your goals are in life, right? So let's talk about this. I just put a bunch of questions up here, which people have asked me over the years. I literally could have made this twice as long. It's intentionally a little bit ridiculous. So let me just look at some of these highlighted ones. It's important to be able to say, well, look, if I'm gating my delivery by people, I've got two choices. I can either add more people or I can move my work. Whether they're projects or epics, doesn't matter, but what should I be delaying? Which initiatives are delayed due to resource availability? When will teams or roles with the right skills become available? What happens if I decide to expand a team, right? If I'm delivering in an Agile methodology, I don't necessarily need to bring in a whole team, but what if I fatten the team, right? And here's another really important one. How will delaying this particular initiative affect other key deliverables? Because as you know, the challenge with portfolio planning is when something slips, it's like pushing the first domino. There's a lot of downstream impacts to that. If people that were planning to move on to other high priority initiatives are suddenly stuck for another 6 to 8 weeks, on an epic or a project, whatever it may be, well, what are the cascading impacts of that? And how do I figure that out relative to achieving my overall portfolio delivery goals, if you will, which ostensibly are tied to your business strategy? All right, so being able to answer those kinds of questions quickly is what makes you adaptable. It's not a bad thing that these kinds of questions come up. They come up in the course of doing business, but not being able to respond to them quickly, that's where the challenge comes in. All right, so let's pop here. Thanks, sorry, bouncing around. The last leg of that, optimizing value delivery. I thought it would be good just to talk about a couple of what are likely well-known organizations that have adopted the principles that we're going to be talking about today over the next 40 minutes or so, specifically resource portfolio management. Let me pick on Deloitte with their permission. This is actually a slide provided by them. You can see the benefits of doing this effectively. All of those clients, customers, if you will, that I showed on that first slide, it was just representative of the hundreds that we have around the world, are they're on this journey, at some point. Deloitte may be a little bit farther along than others. Some people are doing this within just certain aspects of their company. It might be their audit department, it might be their IT department, or it could be worldwide. We've got some organizations that have upwards of 90,000 employees, and they're all working this way. But nonetheless, if we take Deloitte as a representative example of this, 55% more throughput on projects. Within the first year of moving from a traditional project and portfolio management kind of delivery model, where you are task focused as opposed to activity focused and addressing the primary inhibitors to project delivery through resource portfolio management, 55% more projects. We're going to talk about the second bullet as well, being able to simulate instead of react. If in fact you follow good resource planning processes, you should be able to have a good feel for what's coming down the pipe with enough runway to actually do something about it. If you look at some of these surrounding comments, if you will, the IT organization is now regarded as a professional partner because of our high maturity level. We're looking at deriving a strategic HR plan to meet our future skill demand. And we're going to talk about that as well, actually setting up an internal supply chain, if you will, with your own talent, because you'll be able to see in advance where, in fact, you have skills gaps. So this is just one example of a company that is, in fact, having great success optimizing their value delivery while getting the retention and adaptability benefits as well. Okay, so how do we do this? What does resource portfolio management look like? It's actually quite consistent with best practices that hopefully many of you are familiar with relative to the Scaled Agile framework, the PMBOK from PMI, best practices as recommended in operational planning from the Resource Management Institute. All of them say, look, when you're down here, looking at the here and now, if you will, you should have a high confidence level in your forecast. As far as Agile planning, I went ahead and put some program increment planning here roughly every 3 months along this timeline. Essentially, when you hit the PI boundary, you should be doing what you can. Your release train engineer should be, your team should be, to protect the work that you already have in the queue, right? So it's committed. You should be focused on work decomposition, sprint planning, and you're aligning this all the time with the business. But the point being, your forecast for resources are largely fixed here. When you start to move out this way, this is where people start to come off the rails many times. Whether you are more team focused in your history or more waterfall focused, doesn't matter. It's important to be able to look upstream here for a number of reasons. Again, not only is it a best practice, if you look at specifically the Scaled Agile framework, they talk about the importance of roadmap planning, of horizon planning, right? Different terminology perhaps than you might hear in the PMBOK, but you've got to be able to look upstream and start aligning your value stream interdependencies, right? That coordinating which resources are coming on board, because if you wait until the PI planning boundary to do that, in many times it's both unclear and just too late. I live in sunny Salt Lake City, America, and we are sitting on, and have been sitting for the last 18 months, on a 1% unemployment rate out here. It is so challenging. The last time I went to hire project managers, I had exactly one candidate apply from the greater Salt Lake City area, actually from the state of Utah. I had multiple candidates from other states and out of country, but it's indicative of the fact that it actually takes you time to hire and onboard talent. According to the Resource Management Institute, and this is a 2022 stat, 3 to 6 months on average. I know that we, for specialized skills, had positions open for 9 to 12 months that when I left my previous employer, they were still open, still unfilled, right? So point being, if you don't start to account for how you're going to use, especially single-threaded or gated roles out here, you limit your options here. Okay, the retention aspect of this too can't, again, really be undersold. If you're waiting until the PI boundary to get this done, again, you're already inconsistent with best practices, but what a common result of that typically is, oh, you just dump more work on your teams and speed, and roles, I should say. I've had several discussions with release train engineers that have shared with me the fact that they have teams that are working 60 hours a week, which tells me that their planning process is actually antithetical to best practices for Agile delivery. You should not be doing that. You should be pushing work, and they're unable to do that. And I would submit to you a large part of the reason they're unable to do that is because they are not planning effectively upstream. It's important to ask yourself, relative to Agile. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge Agile fan, and Agile is part of this equation. but it's certainly not the end all be all. In the first place, according to Deck Beacon, Forbes, a lot of other companies, the vast majority of companies that are implementing Agile are doing so in a hybrid fashion. It's rare to find people that are pure Agile, and I mean really rare. But then again, as you look at this Harvard Business Review statement here, organizations do have a tendency to say, oh, great, we're going to fix this problem with Agile because we'll have persistent teams that are self-managed, right? And they set up these series of ceremonies and expect everything just to cure itself, and that rarely happens. All right. So let's start talking about how we can actually make this come to fruition. What we recommend is consolidating your upstream roadmap and resource planning. Whether you are executing in a hybrid environment or just Agile or just Waterfall, doesn't matter, right? Again, all of these best practices suggest doing upstream planning. And if you are in an environment where you may have these all executing simultaneously, it becomes particularly important that you consolidate your upstream resource planning. So many folks that I know are wonderful. They're out there executing, Agile. Great. I talked with a chap that was moving 1,000 Agile teams into place for a large British financial institution. Great, right? He's doing rolling 6-quarter planning because that's what he has to do that far out to get the value stream coordination that he needs. So by the time they do joint PI planning, they've already addressed the majority of interdependencies, that sort of a thing, right? It's important to be looking out. So again, most people that are doing roadmaps from an Agile product management perspective are doing them in Visio diagrams, and they're not necessarily tied to resources at all. That from a resource planning perspective, they're a little bit of a wish list. Yes, you're likely to be oriented to 1 or 2 value streams or release trains, if you will, but you've got to start looking at all these external dependencies that you have, especially from a resource perspective, compliance, audit, regulatory, legal. What is it going to take to get these people to play nicely with us? And do they have capacity to do that, given the fact that these are classic shared resources? And they are doing this not only for Agile initiatives, they're doing it likely also simultaneously for Waterfall projects, certainly for operations work. Everybody's got a day job, right? Same thing with Waterfall projects. You should be looking upstream. Your resource plans should allow you to coordinate with teams as well as traditional cross-functional resources that are supplied, as well as those that are not really doing sophisticated planning. They're probably doing operations work, staffing in something like Excel. Pull all that together, if you will. You don't have to, by the way, eat that whole elephant at one time. Do it one organization at a time. And we'll talk about the benefits of doing that. The first step is to build a process where no matter what the initiative is, you size it. Size it by team and role. It doesn't do you much good from a resource planning perspective to size things by release train, art, if you will, or even by project. It's useful for funding purposes, but not necessarily for resource planning purposes. Was working with a release train engineer recently who had about 12 separate teams on his train, and there were 3 teams that were consistently overallocated. And so planning at an art level really didn't do them any good. They had to get it down one more level. So, our recommendation for best practices is plan by team, which is the same as planning by role if you're a traditional resource manager. Again, I'll share another example with you. Worked with a resource manager that had 12 mainframe developers. But as it turned out, again, mainframe development wasn't granular enough. She actually had 3 separate non-fungible roles, meaning she had mainframe developer item processing, mainframe developer bank card, mainframe developer deposits, and the systems, the skill sets were not transferable, not fungible, if you will. And so when she ran out of deposits people, she was done. And so their actual capacity wasn't 12, In terms of doing deposit capacity planning, it was 4, right? And so you've got to make sure that you are, in fact, forecasting at the right level of granularity across the skill sets in your organization. And the automation that you're using needs to be able to support different types of delivery methodologies. In this particular example, if you will, you're able to see role-based estimates, actually named people in here, right? You're able to see the fact that they're pending approval. But you're also, on the same work, on the same timeline, able to lay requests for teams with different velocities on the same work on the same timeline. And that's what good automation will do for you. It will show you immediately as you pull them in whether or not they're already overallocated. I showed a ridiculous amount of overallocation on this diagram. Everybody that's red is overallocated. And you can easily click on them and see what else they're working on. You should be able to, in fact, estimate by team, by story point, by money, by hour, all within the same screen, if you will, which makes adoption really, really easy, right? It makes planning super easy. Also, you should be able to, in fact, if you're a release train engineer, you should have a view of everything that your teams are working on. If you're a portfolio manager or a program manager, you should be able to look up all the work, show me all the projects that are going on in my portfolio, all the resources associated with them, and look down this list and say, hey, who's overallocated? There should, in theory, be little or no red on this particular screen. I'm showing the federal portfolio right here, and you can see across these projects, there's a lot of red going on. If I was a portfolio manager or a program manager, I would be pinging the specific either release train engineers or project managers or Epic owners saying, do you have these risks properly called out? Are you tracking them correctly, right? So this is the kind of view that you get when you have a resource portfolio management approach to tying your strategy with what actually gates strategy execution, which is typically your resources, whether they are organized in teams or as roles. All right, so we size the work when it comes in. The next thing that you do, if you've got the capabilities of resource portfolio management, is interactively model and adapt to changing business conditions. This is the whole adaptability piece. What's nice, if you'll see here, this is typical of a model. Again, we're in organizations all over the place. I just happen to grab one that's an annual audit plan here. But you can see, you can take your epics, your projects, your initiatives. If you're doing pharmaceutical work, we work with with a lot of drug companies. They call them studies, roughly equivalent to a project. And you can say, okay, I've got a new study in the pipeline. What happens if I introduce that work, right? You bring it into your model, which is a snapshot of your production environment. It has all of your production guardrails, to use scaled agile framework terminology, right? When you introduce new work into this model interactively, it will immediately show you the impact on your budget guardrails, your resource guardrails, your work mix guardrails, your planning horizon guardrails, all of that reported in real time. And you can do all kinds of interesting what-if analysis, like taking an effort here and sliding it out by 6 months and seeing immediately all the cascading impacts to all the bottlenecked resources, right? You can come in and say, just do multiple planning scenarios. You can say, well, what if I move these 3 projects? I can crash this other project if I only add 2 people, but I'll save $400,000 by doing that. It's a fabulous way for portfolio planners, and I might say product planners, product managers in particular, when they're looking at adding new capabilities. You can plan on a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year planning horizon. You can take this down to the week and day if you want, but you can start to do that upstream planning that the Harvard Business Review says is so important, and that life history hopefully has convinced you of as well. And you can do it easily without impacting your production environment. Once you do that, once you come up with the optimal plan and you get it approved with your stakeholders, because there's ramifications, you might be suggesting that perhaps we take a risk-based effort and hold off on it for 2 months, right? Because we're going to drive $1 million worth of revenue if we introduce this new capability 2 months sooner. Well, great. That may be an acceptable risk decision. Once you make those decisions, then you go out to your production environment and just adjust your actual production roadmap accordingly. When you do that, it will move those forecasts out, and it effectively reserves capacity for you in a way that's entirely consistent with the optimal plan that you just laid out. You also get the benefit of visibility across your entire enterprise portfolio of all interdependencies. This is an example here. We've got a straight up IT operational initiative that has to be completed prior to both an epic as well as a project. So this should be methodology interdependent. It's also cutting across portfolios. It's the IT portfolio that's actually driving an interdependency for the federal portfolio. This really is sort of the holy grail for portfolio planners. You've obviously got your PI intervals up here, right? So you can have global milestones as well as individual milestones called out here. But to be able to see the interdependencies and the interplay between all of your work, ops work, epics, projects, doesn't matter. The other benefit that you will get as a result of looking at this through a resource portfolio management framework is you get to see what we call resource retention guardrails. Anywhere where there's a checked sort of space here, it means that during that time frame, in this case, we've got this on a month horizon, right? So in the month of May, June, July, for this particular project, you either have an over allocation, meaning you have at least one person that's working over a threshold that you set, typically 100 or 110%, right? Or you have a concurrency threshold, which I'm showing here. Abigail, she may very well only be 100% allocated, but she's working on 6 concurrent entities at one time. Well, I promise you, that's not a good retention strategy. Again, back to the Harvard Business Review article, which I thought summarized this well. I would submit that to you for your consideration to read. It came out in February of 2021. It's called Beyond Burned Out. That's some wonderful guidance in there for what's really driving a lot of the great resignation. And it has to do with people being A, overworked, B, overstressed, feeling like they're not in control of their work, and a key that aligns quite nicely, tragically, with these concurrency risks that we're talking about. Give people too many concurrent things to do, and they feel like they've got a lack of control. And so when you have these capabilities, you're able to do much more granular and effective holistic planning. All right. So what does this mean actually from a portfolio Kanban perspective? I went ahead and tied in this process to the Scaled Agile Framework portfolio Kanban model here. And again, I've stressed this, but I'll re-stress it. Let me read this real quick. This came right off the scaledagileprimeric.com site. Flow requires knowing the total capacity available. Only when this balance is understood can the enterprise objectively evaluate and originate portfolio level work. So again, what we're promoting here is not just what needs to be done, but it's how to do it. And again, it starts with the reviewing state, right? You take things in, and typically this is a cost-driven exercise. Clients will determine whether or not they've got a financial appetite to go into the analyzing state. And then when you go into the analyzing state, what we're suggesting is, oh yeah, this is where you should be doing this in a model. You need to be looking at all of your portfolio guardrails dynamically without impacting production yet, answering all of those questions about what is it going to take to introduce this MVP, right? And what are my options? And you should be doing that long in advance of when you actually expect to do the work. Sometimes this analyzing is done months and months in advance, and that's fine, because once you do that, as part of the approval process, and I actually stuck this approval process in there. This MVP approval is actually not one of their steps. They roll right into portfolio backlog, and those of you that are familiar with this will know that. But in the approval process, which there always is a formal one, why wouldn't you want to include in your lean business case the likely sequence for this? Executives have a tendency to be less concerned about what methodology you're using than they are about, well, when am I going to get my capabilities, right? When are we going to see the benefits from this, right? So why not be able to say with confidence that we are in fact reserving capacity on our teams to be able to deliver these capabilities starting here, right? And you're going to be updating your resource forecast during your regular portfolio syncs, right? And your strategic business reviews, all great. But you can also walk into the MVP approval saying, look, if we don't do anything, we're going to start it here. But if we added 2 people or fattened a team or did this, right, or that, talk about the mitigations that are available so they know they've got some options going into that. Look, I know that people are fond of saying, you know, the whole benefit of Agile is fixed teams and, you know, we should be bringing work to the people, which you are still doing. But I've never met an executive that when presented with a compelling business case wouldn't be okay looking at bringing in professional services as an example, if the business case justified that. Then after you get MVP approval, of course, you update your production roadmap, as we talked about, so that those reservations are made. And then you go execute in whatever software you're using, whether it's Jira, Rally, ADO, you know, doesn't matter. The same thing is actually true for Waterfall or hybrid portfolio value delivery flow, right? It's just a little bit different terminology. I would submit to you the best practices for a Waterfall project would be to try to look at breaking your work into phases so that just as is proposed as best practices and safe, you're able to do some sort of incremental delivery, right? It's a little less structured. You're not seeing it come out every 2 weeks per sprint, but you should still be involving your sponsors and at a minimum, doing the same thing for phased implementation. Look, you initiate it, you plan it, you should do detailed planning, and as part of the approval phase, you should be setting expectations for when we think this thing can actually be delivered. What are the portending resource risks and delivery risks, not only to this initiative, but to operational work and other project work, right? Other epics that are going to be impacted because you're tapping on the shoulder of the same shared resources that they're using, and then you go implement, right? Whether it's Microsoft Project, whatever your PPM tool is of choice, and or Jira. Like I say, it's extremely common, most common, if you will, for people to be delivering certainly IT work in a hybrid environment. And then you just do the same thing you would do for the next phase, just as we talked about previously. You know, when your full implementation comes along or your next stage, you just repeat the process, right? Rinse and repeat. I loved this McKinsey quote, by the way, at the bottom of this. They talk about the need to embed speed in your organization. And I would submit to you that this is a wonderful way to address that issue. Because once you set up routine portfolio planning events, that you are doing this for both projects and Agile initiatives, if you're in a hybrid environment or either one, it's definitely going to speed your delivery. People will have the opportunity to have worked out upstream, you know, these critical both work interdependencies as well as resource interdependencies. So by the time you walk into those portfolio syncs or strategic business reviews, or, you know, if you're just Waterfall, then, you know, the RMI calls them interlock meetings. Doesn't matter. You've got a routine planning event. But by the time you walk in there, you should be walking in there with options instead of starting the negotiation process right then and there, you know, so to speak. So again, the whole idea of resource portfolio management, completely consistent with both the Scaled Agile framework, best practices in portfolio KanBan and Agile delivery, as well as the PMBOK and PMI, you know, resource planning to impact delivery as well. Okay, let me take a breath here. Lest you think that what's being asked here is going to be too burdensome to your organization. let me set your expectation correctly. Look, it's really these middle levels that need to be doing the resource planning. It's the project managers that are making sure that they are sizing their projects, or the epic owners, right? Doing the same with their portfolio level epics. It's the release train engineers and managers that are making sure that they are planning upstream to the extent that they can, right? Knowing that upstream means that these forecasts are going to be fluid or flexible, right? And they'll refine them on a recurring basis. 1 to 2 hours a month is all that it takes. And I tell people all the time, if you think that that's a commitment you can't live with, look, there's 160 working hours on the average month. You can't take less than 1% of that time. All it takes is one nasty resource arbitration to chew up a year's worth of planning in a week. I mean, if you've ever been engaged in that kind of discussion, where you're going back and forth trying to pull in senior business stakeholders and determine, on the fly, which initiatives you're going to be cutting, that's a time-consuming endeavor, and far better to be done, in conjunction with your routine portfolio planning events, where everybody's on board with this, than to be driving that by the exception. Are you going to be getting exceptions? Of course. There's always unplanned work that walks in the door. Is it going to be disruptive to your current PI? Hopefully not, but maybe. But even if you have that event occur, if you're doing this, you're able to have data-driven discussions about what the impacts are, because you can just pop back here to the model, right? And say, look, this is exactly how it's going to impact not only my team, but the other downstream epics and projects and operational work that's being done. And those are wonderful business discussions to be had. They're going to be had one way or another. What you want to do is make sure that you are, in fact, having optimal discussions. All right. One other thing I really wanted to emphasize on this slide, to me, that the reason I put people in teams at the base here is this really is something that I hope you don't lose sight of. The work that we're talking about doing here, resource planning, generally speaking, it is all about benefiting people. This goes back to the retention phase, but it's really more than that. If you've ever had people leave your organization and tell you during their exit interview that the working environment here is ridiculous, I say shame on you, right? I would submit to you that if you take people and move them from working 60 hours a week back to 40 or 45 hours a week, that has a remarkable effect on your ability to retain those people. I would also say that, look, it blesses the lives of their family. They are not taking that stress back home to their family. And if you have arguably stronger families, you're going to have stronger communities, you're going to have stronger society. That is, you might think that's a bit too grandiose, but it's true. Look, why wouldn't that be true? So don't lose sight of the fact that you are, in fact, impacting the lives of people through proper resource planning, and at the same time driving great benefit in terms of both adaptability and value flow to your organization. Wanted to pop up one other example, actual customer example here. This is Siemens in Germany. They've seen 35% more projects over a 10-year period by moving to RPM. And I said RPM/APM because sometimes people call this adaptive portfolio management. And again, I'm fine using that terminology with the understanding that you can't be adaptive unless you're addressing the resource issues, right? And you need to be aligning your strategy execution resources with your actual business strategy. And you do that not just through project and portfolio management, but you do it through resource portfolio management, because that takes into account, again, all methodologies across the entire organization. So some pretty significant benefits here, again, real life from a real customer. All right, let's start to wrap this up here a little bit. Strategic benefits of resource portfolio management. When you are working, in in sort of a well-oiled agile delivery machine or program, if you're doing something from a waterfall perspective, there's no question you're going to get good hindsight from the velocity calculations, the work you're actually delivering. If you're tracking time, also great, right? You can get some insight if you're reaching forward a little bit and trying to pull in some of these resources for your PI planning events. If you're a good project manager, looking out on the time horizons, trying to line these things up. But what you're not getting is foresight. It's the difference between hindsight, insight, and foresight. Let me go back to the the Agile sort of a methodology here. This whole benefit that you get from feedback loops, working with your customers, if you will, every 2 weeks in sprint planning, every roughly 12 weeks in PI planning, right? That's a wonderful thing. It's a huge, important component of that delivery methodology. And projects should be doing the same thing, having regular touch points with their stakeholders about where we are in the process. But from a foresight perspective, you should be doing the same thing. You should get what I call foresight feedback from doing actual upstream modeling of interdependencies, all these things that you get in terms of your portfolio guardrails by actually being able to plan at a reasonable level what's coming, because you've sized your work across teams and people with different velocities, different roles on a common timeline. It all starts with the sizing, and then you move to the modeling, and then you update your actual production schedule based on the optimum models that you've been able to have and the discussions that you've had with the necessary stakeholders. What this does is it allows you to see and share with the C-suite reasonably high confidence level risk expectations and delivery expectations. I was in a very uncomfortable sort of vicarious conversation with a release train engineer that was called on the carpet by a CFO who requested to know when these new capabilities were going to be delivering that he was waiting on. And look, very well-intentioned chap, but he essentially said, I can't tell you because we only plan in 90-day increments. Well, that was the wrong answer for the CFO, I can assure you. And so, being able to set reasonable delivery expectations on a longer timeline is actually a good career protecting move as well, but it's just good business and it's reasonable. And of course, as I've said multiple times already, it's completely consistent with best practices in planning regardless of your delivery methodology. You can look the C-suite or your CIO, in the eyes whenever you want with confidence and say that, look, we are continuously optimizing our value delivery and we're doing it with known production constraints, meaning we know what our hard work interdependencies are and we know where our bottlenecks are. And wow, does that ever change the tenure of those conversations if they're looking to make difficult decisions or introduce new work, or if they had a regulatory project walk in the door, that sort of a thing. It makes your planning much easier. The retention guardrails are designed right into the planning process. The ability to look at the impacts on your people, that's actually embedded in your planning process. It's not an afterthought. Obviously, you get to see risks and interdependencies across the entire portfolio, across multiple portfolios, across all delivery methodologies. You're able to look at your work with enough roadmap to make a difference. Do I want to hire? Am I going to essentially pause an entire strategic theme? You might go into a specific product or portfolio and say, look, we're going to shut off all discretionary work just within this portfolio so that we can get this one highest priority item done on time. Very reasonable to model that. Very easy to model that. You can do it all interactively. And of course, you get to see the what's needed early. Where are my skills gaps early? And if you have people that are interested in moving into those roles, then as part of this process, HR should be coordinating the ability to see people's aspirations and compare them to what we have confidence in terms of what our skills gaps are in the future. You essentially build an internal supply chain that way. It's a wonderful way to build a culture of hiring from within, again, aiding your overall retention. Again, another great quote from McKinsey here. Organizations that can reallocate talent in step with their strategic plans are more than twice as likely to outperform their peers. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Making sure that your talent is consistently aligned with your strategy, right? Strategic plans become strategic when you assign resources to them. That's how life works. Okay, let's talk about what it takes to actually do this. There we go. Critical success factors. Look, you need to have a robust talent planning tool for all your work. We are not suggesting that you throw out your PPM tool, heaven's sakes, Jira, ADO, whatever your agile work decomposition tool is. That would be nutty. But what we are saying is that you should centralize your planning, and that the individuals executing those elements and using those tools should align them with your production roadmap. That roadmaps, in fact, should be data-driven, specifically resource and interdependency data-driven. And they should be validated through models. Every time you introduce new work into an environment or want to introduce proposed work, people should be going through those evaluations so they come to the table with reasonable options instead of just sort of starting those discussions, at a ground level saying, hey, look, we want to do this, right? You can do this through setting some very easy, lightweight governance in place. Have a reasonable policy saying, look, all work should be sized by team and role on a one-year roadmap. Again, I referenced already one customer that does this for a rolling 6-quarter planning, event. So you can take it out longer if you want, but you should be doing it at least for 1 year, if for no other reason than to satiate the CFO, because he's got a right, to look out and say, what are my CapEx and OpEx impacts, that are planned? Always remembering that teams are not committed until PI planning, right? Even though you've gone out and really enhanced your forward-looking upstream planning, things happen on the back end, things slip. And so you want to make sure that you are consistently reforecasting. I recommend on a monthly basis, right? But certainly aligned with your portfolio syncs. And everybody has to have the understanding, when it comes to teams, they're not committed until they raise their hand at the end of PI planning. There needs to be accountability for attending these routine planning events. There needs to be regular risk reporting and mitigations. Again, you can talk about moving people, repurposing people. All of that can be planned inside of the model. And then, if you're looking for a place to get started, look, we can assist with that. We do 30-day trials, those sorts of things. But just from a best practices perspective, you should take wherever you are, whatever tool you're using. There's some capabilities that you're only going to get here through a robust resource planning tool. That's clear. But start, like wherever you are, just start. Go find an overworked team. Have a discussion with the resource manager. Figure out what their real non-fungible roles are and start that process. Otherwise, and I love this quote by Neil A. Maxwell, you're going to end up sacrificing what you want the most for what you want at the moment. One quick war story, and then I'll stop. Was working with a client where they had some very high-profile work walk in the door. They were going to have to stop other initiatives to get this done, or they were going to incur millions of dollars in fines. So a very well-intentioned second-line manager, who essentially ran the QA process, of her own volition, stopped 5 projects, 3 of which were 18 months long, 12 to 18 months, and within 90 days of delivery. Well, they couldn't restart those projects for another 9 months. And so, if if they had been using this process more effectively, they could have had more effective discussions about how to really adapt to that, right? And make sure that they weren't going to disrupt high priority work that was just about to deliver. And so those are some real world situations that resource portfolio management can provide real answers to. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Andy here to start with questions. Appreciate your attendance. Oops,
thank you so much, Lloyd. Oh, if only I told you to turn your alarms off. Look at that. All right, thank you. Sorry, I had to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention for the presentation part. We do have a few minutes left for questions, so I do have some questions already. But if you have any questions for Lloyd, please feel free to throw those into the GoToWebinar console. You'll also see Lloyd's email address there, and obviously there's the Prosymmetry website as well if you need more information. All right, so while people are putting more questions in, let's start with what we've already got, Lloyd. Nice simple question here, although the answer may not be quite so straightforward. Does resource portfolio management achieve significant benefits without the entire organization being involved and participating in the process?
It's a great question, Andy. The answer to that is unquestionably yes. You know, again, if a common adoption profile that we see is that organizations will start, and rightfully so, with their most constrained entities. And they can tell you right away. You go up to the CIO, I promise you they'll be able to tell you who is consistently constrained, who's delivering who's gating portfolio delivery, if you will. And so start there. Look, if you only work with just 3 or 4 teams and get them on board and solve that bottleneck, you've immediately added value. It's like Agile, right? It's an iterative process. And so is it, clearly the more people that you have working together and coordinating, the better it is. But good automation should allow, and mapped with good process, should allow the expectation that Epic owners, release train engineers, project managers should be going out, and even if the entities that they're borrowing from shared services, for an example, aren't participating fully in this process, it's their responsibility to make sure that they have the commitments and the understanding that they're going to be able to pull this resource or these resources off of ops work. And you've got a way to document that. So absolutely, you don't need to boil the whole ocean at once by any means. You should take it one step at a time. In fact, it's got to be iterative.
Mm-hmm. And the benefits that you outlined are so significant that as soon as those organizations, departments, functions, areas that aren't involved see those benefits, they're going to want to be part of that as well, and so are their resources.
Oh yeah, so that's such a great thought and a great comment. It's extremely common, for like a resource planning officer or a resource planning function, no matter how it's titled. As soon as they start doing this and see success, oh yeah, they have people clamoring to them. It takes sort of change management and turns it 180, where people are actually saying, we really want to be a part of this because I'm tired of having my people overworked, right?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, next question. You talked about the ability to still execute work in whatever tool of choice, whether that's on the Agile side or the more traditional Waterfall approach. But if you're planning centrally and you're executing that work in many different separate applications, doesn't that become a bit of an integration and coordination challenge? How's that piece handled?
Oh, it needs to be addressed, to be sure. So, for example, we have clients that will actually, through a REST state API or a direct connector, take, and what's usually passed, by the way, is metadata about either epics or projects. No point in re-entering what the strategic value is, right? How it aligns with what portfolio, who the project manager is, yada, 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 right? It's metadata that you pass back and forth. But there still has to be a coordinated planning function, right? And so what we'll see is, look, the alternative is you still have people planning in Excel, and people have limited visibility to that. The same with PPM tools, the same with a tool like Jira. Even if you get a bolt-on product that allows you to do, some more forward-looking road mapping, what you need is a coordinated cross-portfolio value stream coordination tool And none of those have the capability to do that unless you do centralized planning. Again, I would submit to you that you will actually save time. There's no question you will save time by doing that. Many of these PPM tools, by the way, they've ended up over the years, purchasing a bolt-on product to do resource planning, those kinds of things. And so you're going effectively into a separate tool anyway to do that. Resource planning is its own function. And so to be able to pull up a tool like Tempest, and if it makes sense to do the automation where you tie that together, great. But an automated resource planning tool and doing that planning there and letting you execute remotely is absolutely the best of both worlds. It's the same reason that you don't use your PPM tool or Jira, if you will, to email. Look, they're not email tools, right? They might have some internal communication, but not like Outlook, right? And so you want to use the right tool for the right effort and make sure that you're easily able to flow back and forth between them.
Absolutely. And when it comes to enterprise functions, Excel is never the right tool.
Yeah. I mean, it's just sort of a well-known issue. If you're going to try that at scale, you better have dedicated resources doing it, and a lot of them.
Yep. And it worked out still higher risk and more costly than the right dedicated solution. All right.
Yeah, that's right.
Let me try and squeeze in one more question here. I know we're a little short on time. How can you use modeling to improve the quality of the routine portfolio syncs or strategic portfolio reviews? How can that modeling piece sort of improve performance?
That's a great question. Essentially, you can have as many models as you want. So you can have product managers out there. Again, all this is subject to security access and those sorts of things, but they can be working within their own domain, setting up their own models. But it's going against a common enterprise-wide database on the back end, right? So when you take a snapshot of that, you're in there saying, okay, here's all these other issues that are vying for my team, or they're vying for shared resources that my team needs to deliver, right? So product managers can go in there and have worked out a lot of these issues before they walk in the door of the portfolio sync. And the same is true of anybody else that's invited to that sync, right? As long as the people that are planning up front set the right expectations, that if you're bringing people to the table to this meeting, compliance, audit, regulatory, legal, any shared services, right? You should be having those discussions, and let's see, right, initially what that looks like. So size their involvement, right? Put them into the model. You can just add resources to any project or epic, and then see what it looks like relative to the other commitments that they have. So it really makes the discussions data-driven and far more effective than they otherwise would be.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lloyd. I would love to get to some more questions, but we are out of time, I'm afraid. And I did promise everybody that I would give you information about the PDU. So let me do that before we wrap up. This webinar will be available for one PDU in the business acumen part of the talent triangle. If that name sounds familiar, it's because they've just changed the names. It used to be strategic business management. It's now business acumen is the area of the talent triangle. And this will be a self-reported PDU. So you can go to the report PDU section of PMI's website and enter this in as one business acumen PDU that will also be included in the email that you will receive after this. So thank you everybody for attending. Really appreciate it. Lloyd, thank you so much for such an engaging presentation. We had some great engagement from everybody, and I know everyone was able to get a lot out of it. You can see the email address and the website on the screen there if you need anything more. And if not, please join us again for the next webinar real soon. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Andy.